What would you do if everyone told you that you were worthless? What if the world looked at you and saw nothing but failure, nothing but broken dreams and wasted potential? Could you prove them wrong with just one chance? One moment, one song. This is the story of a man who did exactly that. But before we get to that unforgettable night, the night that would change everything, you need to understand what brought him there. You need to know about the hands that would touch those keys, the scars they carried, and the music that had been silent for far too long. It was a cold November evening in Manhattan. Inside the Riverside Concert Hall, crystal chandeliers cast golden light across a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. The annual Veterans Hope Charity Gala was in full swing. Champagne flowed freely. Laughter echoed off marble walls. 500 of New York's wealthiest citizens had gathered to write checks and feel good about themselves for one night. At the front of the hall sat a magnificent Steinway grand piano, polished to perfection, waiting for the evening's featured performance. The program listed the renowned concert pianist David Morrison as the night's entertainment. But David Morrison was stuck at JFK Airport, his flight from London delayed by mechanical issues. And the show, as they say, must go on. Sarah Chen, the event coordinator, was in full panic mode. She'd called every pianist she knew. Every single one was already booked or too far away to make it in time. The guests were getting restless. Some were already heading for the exits. 500 guests who'd paid $2,000 a plate, expecting world-class entertainment. That's when Sarah looked through the glass doors at the front entrance and saw him. A man stood outside in the cold, his face pressed against the glass, looking in with an expression of such profound longing that it stopped Sarah in her tracks. He was maybe 45 years old, African-American, with close-cropped graying hair and a face that had seen too much. His green military jacket was faded and torn at the shoulders. His jeans were dirty and patched. His boots had holes in them. And yet the way he looked at that piano, it was like he was looking at a lost love, a remembered dream, something sacred he'd been separated from for far too long. Sarah didn't know what possessed her in that moment. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was intuition, maybe it was something else entirely. But she walked to those doors, pushed them open, and said 4 words that would change everything. "Can you play piano?" The man looked at her with eyes that held oceans of pain and surprise. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough from disuse, but carried traces of education of a life that had once been different. "I used to," he said. "A long time ago." "How long ago? 20 years? Maybe more." Sarah looked at the man's hands. They were scarred, burned, the skin stretched tight in places. These were hands that had seen trauma, hands that had been broken and rebuilt. But before she could second-guess herself, before rational thought could override instinct, she heard herself say, "We need a pianist. Right now. Would you be willing to try?" The man stared at her like she was offering him the keys to heaven and hell simultaneously. His hands trembled. His jaw clenched. For a long moment, Sarah thought he would refuse, would turn and disappear back into the Manhattan night. But then, barely audible, he whispered, "Yes." Sarah didn't ask his name, didn't ask his story. There wasn't time. She led him through a side entrance, past shocked volunteers through the backstage area. She could feel the stares, hear the whispered objections. But she kept walking, and he kept following, until they reached the wings of the stage. "When I introduce you," Sarah said, "just walk out and play whatever you want. Can you do that?" The man nodded, But Sarah could see the absolute terror in his eyes, mixed with something else. Something that looked like hope that had been buried so long it had almost forgotten how to breathe. Sarah walked onto the stage. The conversations died down. 500 faces turned toward her, expectant, impatient, ready to be entertained or ready to leave. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart due to unforeseen circumstances. "David Morrison is unable to perform tonight. However, we have another pianist who has graciously agreed to play for us this evening. Please welcome our guest performer." And then he walked out. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The man stepped into the spotlight in his torn jacket and dirty jeans. His boots left faint marks on the polished stage. His hair was unkempt. His face was lined with exhaustion and hard living. He looked exactly like what he was, a homeless man who had no business being on that stage in that hall in front of those people. The murmurs started immediately, then the objections, then the outright protests. "Is this some kind of joke? Get him off the stage. This is insulting. We paid $2,000 for this. Someone call security." Near the front, a man in an expensive suit stood up. Richard Blackwell, hedge fund manager, board member of 3 Fortune 500 companies, and a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. His face was red with indignation. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he bellowed. "This is a charity event for veterans, not a shelter. Get this homeless man out of here immediately." Others joined in. The protest grew louder. Some people were already gathering their things to leave. Security guards moved toward the stage, uncertain, but ready to remove the intruder if ordered. Through it all, the man stood frozen at the edge of the stage. His hands hung at his sides, trembling. His eyes were fixed on the floor. Every fiber of his being seemed to scream that he wanted to run, to disappear, to go back to being invisible, like he'd been for so long. But Sarah Chen stepped in front of him, her small frame somehow commanding attention. "Please," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Please, just give him one chance. 5 minutes. If you don't like what you hear, he'll leave. But please, just 5 minutes." The objections continued, but Sarah stood firm. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the crowd quieted slightly. Not silent, not accepting, but willing barely to see what would happen next. The man, moving like he was walking through deep water, slowly crossed the stage. Each step seemed to take monumental effort. He reached the piano bench and stood there for a long moment, staring down at the keys like they were a language he'd once known, but had forgotten. Then he sat down. The crowd was still muttering, still hostile, still ready to condemn. He placed his scarred hands on his lap, closed his eyes, and took one deep, shaking breath. And in that moment, frozen in time, we need to pause this story. Because to understand what happened next, to truly understand the miracle that was about to unfold, you need to know about Ray Bennett. You need to know about the boy he was, the man he became, and the hell he survived to reach this moment. Let me take you back, way back, to where it all began. Ray Bennett was born in Harlem in 1979 to Angela Bennett, a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. His father had left before Ray was born, just another disappeared man in a neighborhood full of them. But Angela Bennett was made of steel, wrapped in love. She worked as a nurse's aide during the day, cleaned offices at night, and took in sewing on weekends. She had one absolute rule: Ray was going to have opportunities she never had. Their apartment was small, just 2 rooms in a building that groaned and leaked when it rained. But it was clean, it was safe, and it was filled with Angela's fierce determination that her son would be more. Do more, become more than the poverty around them suggested was possible. When Ray was 6 years old, Angela scraped together enough money to enroll him in the after-school program at the Harlem Community Center. It was there in a basement room with peeling paint and folding chairs that Ray first saw a piano. It was an old upright donated decades earlier by some forgotten benefactor. Most of the kids ignored it, preferring basketball or video games. But Ray was drawn to it like iron to a magnet. He would stand next to it during free time, reaching up to press the keys, fascinated by how each one made a different sound. How those sounds could be combined and layered and woven into something that made his chest feel tight and his eyes sting with tears he didn't understand. Miss Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the music room, noticed. She was 73 years old, had taught piano for 50 years, and had long since stopped expecting miracles. But when she saw 6-year-old Ray at that piano, something made her pause. "You want to learn how to really play that?" she asked him one afternoon. Ray looked up at her with eyes too serious for a child. "I want to play like the people on Mama's radio, the ones who make her cry when she's tired." Miss Patterson's heart cracked open right there. She sat down next to Ray on the piano bench that day and placed his small hands on the keys. "Then we'll start with this," she said, and played a simple C major scale. Ray repeated it perfectly on the first try. Miss Patterson played a simple melody. Ray repeated it note for note. She played a more complex progression. Ray frowned in concentration, but he got it right. By the end of that first session, Miss Patterson knew she'd found something rare. Not just talent. Talent was common enough. But this child had something deeper. A connection to music that was almost spiritual, as if he could hear not just the notes, but the emotions behind them. The stories they told, the pain and joy they carried. For the next 10 years, Miss Patterson taught Ray everything she knew. She came in early and stayed late, working with him hours beyond the official program time. She bought him books from used bookstores. She took him to free concerts in the park. She introduced him to Mozart and Beethoven Chopin and Rachmaninoff Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk. Angela worked extra shifts to buy Ray keyboard books and pay for the occasional private lesson when Miss Patterson could arrange one with her former students who had become professional musicians. Mother and son would sit in their small apartment late at night, Angela folding laundry, while Ray practiced on a tiny electronic keyboard they'd bought secondhand. The volume turned down so low, only he could really hear it. By the time Ray was 12, he was playing pieces that most adult pianists struggled with. By 14, he was composing his own music, beautiful, haunting melodies that seemed to channel all the hope and heartbreak of Harlem itself. And by 16, the impossible happened. Ray auditioned for the Juilliard school. The day Ray played his audition piece for Juilliard, Angela took the day off from all 3 jobs, something she'd never done before. She put on her one good dress and sat in the waiting area with her hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. Ray walked into that audition room, looked at the panel of 3 stern-faced professors, and sat down at the most beautiful piano he'd ever touched. They asked him to play a Bach prelude. He did. They asked for a Chopin nocturne. He played it flawlessly. Then they asked him to play something of his own composition. Ray closed his eyes and played the piece he'd written for his mother. It was called 3 Jobs, and it captured everything: the exhaustion, the sacrifice, the love that kept working even when the body begged to stop. It was painful and beautiful and achingly honest. When he finished, there was silence in the room. Then the lead professor, a woman named Doctor, Steinberg, who was legendary for her harsh critiques, did something she'd never done in 30 years of auditions. She stood up and clapped. Ray Bennett was accepted to Juilliard with a full scholarship. The day the acceptance letter arrived, Angela Bennett cried for an hour straight. Not sad tears, pure joy. Her baby, her son, was going to Juilliard. The dream that had seemed impossible was real. Ray's years at Juilliard were everything he'd hoped for and more. He was no longer the poor kid from Harlem who played on a donated upright. He was a serious musician among serious musicians. He studied under the best teachers in the world. He practiced 8 hours a day. He performed in recitals and competitions. He won awards. By his senior year, Ray Bennett was considered one of the most promising young pianists in the country. Concert halls were reaching out. Recording companies were interested. His professors were already talking about a career that could span decades, a legacy that could inspire generations. Ray had a plan. He would graduate in May, spend the summer preparing, and in September he would debut at Lincoln Center with a performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was all arranged. His future was a shining path laid out before him. And then in March of his senior year, everything shattered. Angela Bennett had ignored the cough for months. She was 54 years old and still working those same 3 jobs, still determined to see her son succeed. When she finally went to the doctor because Ray begged her to, because the cough had gotten so bad she couldn't hide it anymore, the news was devastating. Stage 4 lung cancer. Metastasized to her liver and bones. The doctor gave her 6 months, maybe 8, with aggressive treatment. Ray's world ended in that moment. He dropped out of Juilliard immediately. His professors pleaded with him to finish the semester to at least complete his degree, but Ray wouldn't hear it. His mother had sacrificed everything for him. He would do the same for her. The next 4 months were a nightmare, rendered in slow motion. Ray spent every day at his mother's bedside. The cancer moved fast, faster than the doctors predicted. The treatments that were supposed to help only seemed to make her worse. She lost weight until she was barely recognizable. The strong, fierce woman who had worked 3 jobs and raised him alone became a fragile shell that hurt to look at. But even in her weakness, even in her pain, Angela Bennett was worried about her son. "Ray," she whispered one night, her voice barely audible. "Promise me something. Anything, Mama. Anything. Don't let this kill your music. Don't let losing me make you forget who you are. You have a gift, baby. A real gift. And gifts like that don't come from us. They come through us. You have to share it. You have to play. Promise me." Ray held her hand, feeling how thin it had become, how her bones seemed too close to the surface. "I promise, Mama. I promise." Angela Bennett died on July 14th, 3 months after her diagnosis. Ray was holding her hand. Her last words were, "Make them hear your song, baby. Make them hear." The funeral was small. Miss Patterson was there, looking older than Ray had ever seen her. A few neighbors, some of Angela's co-workers. They lowered his mother into the ground on a gray morning that matched Ray's soul. At 23 years old, Ray Bennett was alone in the world. The months after his mother's death were a blur of pain and bureaucracy. There were medical bills. So many medical bills. Even with insurance, the treatments had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Angela had taken out loans she couldn't afford, used credit cards she couldn't pay back, all trying to buy a few more months, a few more days. Ray inherited all of it, every penny of debt. He had no degree, no income, no family. The scholarship to Juilliard was gone. The contracts that had been offered were rescinded when he dropped out. The music world moves fast, and Ray Bennett was yesterday's promise forgotten almost as quickly as he'd appeared. He tried to get work. He applied to restaurants, to retail stores, to anything that would pay. But he had no work history, no references except music professors who were disappointed in him. And he discovered what millions of Americans already knew, that in this country, being broke is expensive. Every setback costs money he didn't have. Every missed payment added fees he couldn't pay. Within 6 months, Ray was evicted from the apartment he'd grown up in. He spent a week sleeping on Miss Patterson's couch, but she was living on Social Security and couldn't afford to help him long-term. He tried a homeless shelter, but the crowds and noise and ever-present threat of violence made his newly developed anxiety spiral out of control. So Ray started living on the streets. At first he told himself it was temporary, just until he got back on his feet, just until he found work, just until the grief wasn't quite so crushing. But days turned to weeks, turned to months, and Ray was still on the streets, still carrying everything he owned in a backpack, still trying to figure out how his life had gone from concert halls to concrete sidewalks. He didn't play piano anymore. Couldn't. Every time he thought about music, he thought about his mother. Every melody reminded him of promises he'd broken. The grief was too raw, too immediate. So he shut that part of himself down, locked it away in some deep place where it couldn't hurt him anymore. For 2 years, Ray survived on the streets of New York. He learned where the soup kitchens were, which subway grates were warmest in winter, how to avoid the cops who would roust homeless people from their sleeping spots. He learned how to disappear, how to become one of the invisible people that crowds look through rather than at. And then one day a military recruiter saw him. Staff Sergeant Miller was heading home from his recruiting office in the Bronx when he saw Ray sitting outside a coffee shop reading a book someone had left behind. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But Miller had been doing this job for 15 years, and he'd learned to spot potential in unlikely places. He saw a young man, maybe 25, clearly homeless, but not defeated. Still reading, still trying to learn to grow to be something. Miller sat down next to him. "You ever think about serving your country?" Miller asked. Ray looked up, surprised. "What? The army? You ever consider it?" Ray almost laughed. "Man, I'm homeless. I don't even have an ID anymore. The army doesn't want people like me." But Miller smiled. "Actually, we do. We need people who know what it means to be hungry. People who've been knocked down and gotten back up. People who understand sacrifice." Over the next hour, Miller painted a picture that Ray desperately wanted to believe in. Regular pay, 3 meals a day, a place to sleep, training, purpose, and most importantly, a chance to restart his life to become someone again instead of no one. The next week, Ray Bennett enlisted in the United States Army. Basic training was hard, but Ray had lived on the streets for 2 years. He knew hard. He knew pain. He knew how to keep going when every part of him wanted to quit. He excelled in training. He was smart, disciplined, and motivated by something deeper than most recruits, the absolute determination to never be that helpless again. After training, Ray was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division. He deployed to Afghanistan in 2004. For the first time since his mother's death, Ray felt like he had a purpose. He was good at being a soldier. He was calm under pressure. He was reliable. His unit trusted him. In the chaos of war, Ray found a strange kind of peace. Here everyone was trying to survive. Here your past didn't matter. Only what you did in the moment. Ray did 2 tours, 4 years in total. He saw things that changed him. He lost friends to IEDs and sniper fire. He was in firefights that lasted hours. He learned what it meant to be afraid and keep going anyway. And then, on what was supposed to be his last month before returning stateside, everything went wrong. It was a routine patrol. If anything in Afghanistan could be called routine. Ray's unit was checking on a village that had reported suspicious activity. It was a hot day in September, the kind of heat that made body armor feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. They were walking single file along a dirt road when Ray saw something. Just a glint of metal where it shouldn't be. An instinct honed by 4 years of war screamed at him to stop. "IED," he yelled. Everybody back. But he was a half-second too late. The explosion was enormous, an improvised explosive device buried in the road triggered by their movement. The blast picked Ray up and threw him 15 feet. His ears were ringing so loud he couldn't hear anything else. He couldn't see through the dust and smoke. When his vision cleared, Ray looked down at his hands. They were on fire. The burning phosphorus from the IED had splashed across his hands and wrists. He watched almost detached from the pain as his skin bubbled and blackened. Someone was screaming. It took him a long moment to realize it was him. The medics got to him fast. They put out the fires, wrapped his hands, shot him full of morphine. The helicopter came. The last thing Ray remembered before passing out was looking at his bandaged hands and thinking, "I'll never play again." He was right. Ray spent 4 months in military hospitals. First in Germany, then at Walter Reed in Washington, D.C. The burns on his hands were classified as 3rd degree. The skin was gone in places down to the muscle and tendons. They did multiple skin grafts, multiple surgeries. The doctors saved his hands. Technically, he could still use them for daily tasks, but the nerve damage was extensive. He'd lost sensation in some areas, had hypersensitivity in others. The scar tissue was thick and inflexible. His fingers, which had once moved across piano keys with impossible speed and grace, now moved stiffly, clumsily. A specialist came to see him 6 weeks into his recovery. Dr. Morrison was a hand surgeon with 30 years of experience. He examined Ray's hands carefully, asked him to perform various movements, tested his grip strength and dexterity. Finally, Dr. Morrison sat down and delivered the verdict. Ray had been dreading Mr. Bennett. "I know your records show you were a musician before you enlisted. A pianist, specifically." Ray nodded, unable to speak. "I'm very sorry, but you need to understand that the damage to your hands is permanent. With therapy, you'll regain most functionality for daily life, but the fine motor control required for professional piano playing, that's gone. You might be able to play simple songs, but anything complex, anything that requires real technique, I'm sorry, that part of your life is over." Ray stared at the doctor, then at his hands, then back at the doctor. "You're sure I'm sure? I'm very sorry." After the doctor left, Ray sat alone in his hospital room and looked at his scarred, damaged hands. The hands that had once played Rachmaninoff. The hands his mother had kissed when he got his Juilliard acceptance letter. The hands that were supposed to make them hear his song. He didn't cry. He was past crying. He just felt a vast, empty nothing where his future used to be. The Army gave him an honorable discharge with full veterans benefits. They gave him medals for his service. They thanked him for his sacrifice. And then they sent him back to civilian life with a check, a prescription for pain medication, and a diagnosis of severe PTSD. Ray Bennett returned to New York in the winter of 2008. He was 30 years old. He had no home, no job, no family, no music, just hands that didn't work right anymore, and nightmares that wouldn't stop. Within 3 months, he was back on the streets. The years that followed blurred together into one long nightmare. Ray's veterans benefits should have been enough to get him back on his feet. But PTSD isn't just anxiety and flashbacks. It's a fundamental break in how your brain processes the world. Ray couldn't hold down a job because sudden noises would send him diving for cover. He couldn't sleep in shelters because the crowds triggered his hypervigilance. He couldn't form relationships because he'd trained himself not to get close to people who might die. The pain medication the VA prescribed helped with his hands, but made everything else worse. He developed a dependency. When the prescriptions ran out, he found other ways to manage the pain. It's a story told a million times. In America, veteran comes home, broken, falls through the cracks, disappears into the invisible population of the homeless. Ray wandered the streets of Manhattan for 7 years. He saw the city change around him. New buildings going up, old neighborhoods gentrifying, the rich getting richer, while the invisible people like him just tried to survive another day. He never touched a piano. Couldn't. The few times he'd tried, the pain in his hands, combined with the memories of everything he'd lost, were too much to bear. Better to forget. Better to lock that part of himself away completely. Ray learned the rhythms of street life, where to get free meals, which subway stations were safest to sleep in, how to avoid the gangs and the predators that hunted the vulnerable. He learned how to be invisible, to be one of the thousands of people that New Yorkers step around without seeing. Most days he felt like a ghost, like he'd died in that explosion in Afghanistan, and everything since was just an extended haunting. He was 44 years old and felt 90. His hair was going gray. His body hurt constantly. His mind was a prison of regrets and what-ifs. And then came November 15th, a cold Tuesday evening when everything changed. Ray had no plan to go anywhere near the Riverside concert hall that night. He was just walking like he did most evenings when it got too cold to stay still. Walking helped with the pain. Walking kept the memories at bay. But something made him stop outside the concert hall. Maybe it was the music he could hear faintly through the thick walls. Maybe it was the light spilling out through the tall windows. Maybe it was just chance or fate, or whatever force guides the universe when it decides to give someone a second chance they don't deserve. Ray stood outside in the cold and looked through the glass doors at the world he used to belong to. He saw the people in their expensive clothes laughing and drinking. He saw the stage, and he saw the piano. The Steinway Grand gleamed under the stage lights. Ray hadn't seen a piano like that in 15 years. Hadn't let himself really look at one, since the last time he'd played. But now, staring through that glass, he felt something he thought had died completely. Longing, not for the life he'd lost. That was gone, and couldn't be recovered. But for the music itself. For the feeling of his hands on keys, of finding the notes that matched the emotions he couldn't express any other way. For just one moment of being who he used to be, of remembering that he was once Ray Bennett, the pianist, not just Ray the homeless veteran, Ray the invisible man. He didn't know how long he stood there. Long enough that his hands were numb from the cold. Long enough that the woman inside noticed him. Sarah Chen had been running up and down the hall trying to find any solution to her pianist problem. She'd exhausted every option, called every favor. She was about to admit defeat when she glanced at the entrance and saw him. A homeless man, clearly, but something about the way he looked at that piano made her pause. She'd grown up around music. Her mother had been a concert violinist. Sarah knew that look. It was the look of someone who understood, who could hear the instrument calling even from a distance. What possessed her to open those doors, she would never quite be able to explain. Desperation, yes, but also something deeper. An instinct that this stranger looking through the glass with such desperate hunger might be the miracle she needed. She opened the doors. She asked the question, "Can you play piano?" And Ray, who hadn't played in 15 years, who had been told by doctors he would never play professionally again, who had buried that part of himself so deep he thought it was dead, heard himself answer, "I used to. A long time ago." Everything that happened next felt like a dream. Being led inside. Being brought backstage. Seeing the piano up close enough to touch. The absolute terror of walking out onto that stage, into the lights, into the stares of 500 people who looked at him and saw only a homeless man, only someone who didn't belong. The protests, the shouts, the man in the expensive suit demanding he be thrown out, the security guards moving toward him. All of it washed over Ray like white noise because he couldn't take his eyes off the piano. And then somehow he was sitting on the bench. The piano was even more beautiful up close. The keys were perfect, pristine ivory and ebony. Ray's scarred, shaking hands hovered over them. He could feel the crowd's hostility like a physical weight. He could hear the murmurs, the barely restrained anger. For a moment, Ray considered just standing up and leaving, going back to the streets where he belonged. But then he remembered. He remembered his mother sitting in their tiny apartment while he practiced on that cheap keyboard. He remembered her face the day he got into Juilliard. He remembered her last words. "Make them hear your song, baby. Make them hear." He remembered Miss Patterson spending hours teaching him when she should have been home resting. He remembered the first time he ever touched a piano, that sense of rightness of this is what I'm supposed to do. He remembered being 23 years old and full of dreams. He remembered believing music could change the world, could heal wounds, could make people feel less alone. And he remembered that he'd promised his mother he wouldn't let losing her kill his music, promised he would share his gift, promised he would play. Ray closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. His hands were shaking so badly he wasn't sure he could even hit the right keys. The scar tissue pulled tight. The nerve damage made his fingers feel foreign, disconnected. But he placed his hands on the keys anyway. The crowd was still protesting, still demanding he be removed. But Ray couldn't hear them anymore. He was somewhere else now, somewhere deeper. He thought, "This is for you, Mama. Everything I am, everything I was, everything I might still be. This is for you." And then Ray Bennett began to play. The opening notes were tentative, uncertain. Ray's fingers fumbled at first. 15 years of not playing. 15 years of scar tissue and nerve damage and PTSD. His hands didn't move the way they used to. They couldn't. He started with something simple. A basic C major scale. The most fundamental exercise every pianist learns. His fingers were stiff. The notes weren't clean, but they were notes. They were music. The crowd's protests didn't stop immediately. If anything, those first uncertain sounds seemed to confirm their worst assumptions. This was a mistake. This homeless man couldn't play. This was an embarrassment. But Ray wasn't playing for them. Not yet. He was playing for his hands, relearning their own language. Each note was a negotiation between memory and limitation. His muscle memory knew where the keys should be, but the damaged nerves wouldn't always let his fingers go there. So he adapted. He found new pathways, new ways to reach the notes he needed. He moved from the scale into a simple melody. Amazing Grace, his mother's favorite hymn, the one she used to hum while she worked. Ray's version was slow, halting. Notes dropped occasionally. His timing wasn't perfect. But something was happening. The melody, even played imperfectly, was recognizable. And there was something in the way Ray played it. something raw and honest that made it more than just notes on a page. Each note carried weight, emotion, story. A few people in the crowd stopped talking to listen. Not many, but a few. Ray felt the piano responding to him, or maybe he was responding to it. After 15 years of silence, the instrument felt like an old friend he'd abandoned, but the friendship wasn't gone, just dormant, waiting. His confidence grew note by note. His fingers started remembering. Not perfectly. They would never be perfect again, but they remembered enough. Ray transitioned from amazing grace into something more complex. A Chopin nocturne. Op. 9. Number 2. One of the first pieces he'd learned at Juilliard. His fingers knew this piece the way his lungs knew how to breathe. The nocturne was harder, faster, more technically demanding. Ray's hands struggled. Some runs weren't clean, some chords weren't full, but he pushed through, adapting to his limitations, finding ways to make the music work, even when his hands couldn't do everything they used to. And the crowd went silent. Not completely. Not everyone. But the protests stopped. The outrage paused. Because what they were hearing, even imperfect, even flawed, was undeniably real. This wasn't a homeless man pretending to play. This was a musician who knew what he was doing, even if his body wouldn't fully cooperate. Richard Blackwell, the man who had demanded Ray be thrown out, slowly sat back down. He was frowning, but he was listening. Others followed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses were set down. People who had been heading for the exits paused. Ray finished the nocturne. The last notes hung in the air, and for a moment there was genuine silence. Not hostile silence, anticipatory silence. The kind of silence that asks what comes next. Ray knew what came next. He'd known from the moment he sat down, even if he hadn't admitted it to himself. He was going to play the piece he'd never performed. The piece he'd written 25 years ago. The piece he'd composed for his mother. Ray's hands hovered over the keys. This was the moment. The edge of the cliff. He could play something safe, something classical, something that wouldn't rip his heart open. Or he could play the truth. He played the truth. The opening notes were soft, gentle. A lullaby that became a work song. The melody captured his mother's essence, strong but tender, exhausted but determined, carrying burdens no one should have to carry alone. Ray had written this piece when he was 21, in his 3rd year at Juilliard. He'd called it 3 Jobs, because that's what it was about. The sound of his mother's footsteps coming home at midnight after her 2nd shift. The way she would hum to herself while she cooked breakfast before heading to her 1st job. The soft crying he sometimes heard through the thin walls when she thought he was asleep, when the weight of keeping them afloat became too much. The piece wasn't technically perfect. It had never been meant for concert halls. It was too personal, too raw, but that's what made it powerful. Ray's scarred hands moved across the keys, finding the melody he'd written so long ago. The damage to his hands meant he couldn't play it exactly as he'd composed it. Some of the faster runs were impossible now. Some of the complex chords had to be simplified. But the emotion was there. Every note was saturated with love and grief and gratitude and regret. The music painted a picture. Early mornings and late nights. Sacrifices made without complaint. A mother who gave everything and asked for nothing. A boy who didn't understand the depth of that sacrifice until it was too late. In the audience, People who had come expecting entertainment were getting something else entirely. They were getting truth. Uncomfortable, beautiful truth about love and loss and the people who break themselves to give others a chance. Sarah Chen, standing in the wings, had tears streaming down her face. She didn't know Ray's story, but she could hear it in every note. The music built layer by layer. The melody became more complex, more urgent. This was the part of the piece that represented his mother's illness, watching her fade, the desperate, helpless feeling of losing the only person who had ever truly believed in him. Ray's hands were aching now. The nerve damage meant extended playing caused pain. But he couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Not until he'd played every note of the song he should have played for her 20 years ago. The piece moved through the grief into something else. Acceptance. Gratitude for the time they'd had. Understanding of the gifts she'd given him, not just in music, but in everything. The way she'd taught him to work hard, to never give up, to be kind even when the world wasn't kind back. And finally the ending. Soft, peaceful, a release. The musical equivalent of I love you. I'm sorry. Thank you. Goodbye. The last notes faded into silence. Ray sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the keys, his eyes closed, tears running down his face. He hadn't cried in years, hadn't let himself. But the music had opened something in him that had been locked shut since the day his mother died. The hall was absolutely silent, 500 people holding their collective breath. And then someone started clapping. The applause started with one person, a woman in the third row who couldn't hold it in anymore. Her clapping was loud in the silence, almost defiant. Then another person joined, then 3 more, then a dozen. But Ray barely heard it. He was still lost in the music, in the memories, in the grief he'd been running from for so long. Playing that piece had been like lancing a wound that had festered for 20 years. It hurt. God, it hurt. But it was also a relief so profound, he could barely breathe. Slowly, Ray opened his eyes. He looked down at his hands, still resting on the keys. His scarred, damaged, impossible hands. The hands that doctors said would never play professionally again. They were shaking. They hurt. But they had just played his mother's song. The applause was growing, spreading through the audience like ripples in water. Not everyone was clapping. Some people still looked skeptical, uncomfortable, unsure how to process what they'd just heard. But the resistance was cracking. Ray took a shaky breath and made a decision. He wasn't done yet. Without announcing it, without pausing to acknowledge the applause, Ray began playing again. But this time it was different. This time, he was playing for them. For the 500 strangers who had looked at him with disgust and judgment. For every person who had ever looked at a homeless veteran and seen trash instead of a human being. For everyone who had forgotten that invisible people have stories too. He started playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. 3rd movement. The crowd quieted immediately. This was one of the most famous piano pieces in the world, and also one of the most technically demanding. Ray's teachers at Juilliard had called it the proving ground because it separated real pianists from pretenders. The piece required speed precision and phenomenal finger independence. It was brutal on healthy hands. On hands like Ray's, it should have been impossible. Ray played it anyway. His version wasn't perfect. It couldn't be. There were moments where his damaged nerves wouldn't let his fingers move fast enough, where the scar tissue pulled too tight and forced him to adjust. But Ray didn't hide from those limitations. He embraced them. He adapted the piece, found new ways to express the same emotions, even when he couldn't hit every note exactly as written. And somehow that made it more powerful, Because this wasn't a performance anymore. It was a statement. It was proof. It was a scarred, broken man showing the world that broken things can still be beautiful. That damaged doesn't mean destroyed. That you can lose everything and still have something worth sharing. The crowd was mesmerized now. Even the skeptics couldn't look away. They were watching something extraordinary. Not just music, but resurrection. A man rising from his own ashes in real time. Richard Blackwell, who 20 minutes ago had been demanding Ray be thrown out, was leaning forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open. He'd been to hundreds of concerts, heard dozens of world-class pianists, but he'd never heard anything like this. Because this wasn't just technical skill, this was a story being told in music. Every note said, "I survived. I endured. I'm still here. You can knock me down, but you can't keep me down. You can break me, but you can't destroy me." The Moonlight Sonata. Built to its thundering conclusion. Ray's hands were flying across the keys now, muscle memory taking over the pain, fading into background noise as the music consumed him completely. And then he did something unexpected. Instead of ending the piece as written, Ray smoothly transitioned into jazz improvisation. He took the classical melody and transformed it, added blues notes and syncopated rhythms, turned Beethoven into something that sounded like it was born in Harlem, in the streets, in the struggle and triumph of survival. This was Ray's gift. This was what had made him special at Juilliard. He could take any piece of music and make it his own, could bridge genres and styles, could speak multiple musical languages and blend them into something unique. He improvised for 3 minutes, building and releasing tension, creating musical conversations between the classical and the contemporary, between the past and the present, between who he had been and who he had become. It was breathtaking. The energy in the hall had completely shifted. The hostility was gone, replaced by something else. Awe, respect, and for something deeper, guilt. Because everyone in that room was being forced to confront their own prejudices. 20 minutes ago, they had looked at Ray and seen only a homeless man, someone to be removed, someone who didn't belong. And they had been so sure, so certain in their judgment. But now they were hearing a master at work, someone who, despite having every reason to give up, despite losing everything, despite hands that shouldn't be able to do this, was creating beauty that brought them to tears. A woman in the 5th row was openly crying. She'd spent thousands on tickets, had come expecting to be entertained, and instead was having her heart broken and rebuilt by music played by a man she'd wanted ejected. A man in the 2nd row, a music critic for the New York Times, who'd been ready to write a scathing review about this stunt, was typing furiously on his phone, his hands shaking. Sarah Chen, watching from backstage, could barely believe what was happening. Her desperate gamble, her crazy moment of intuition had somehow worked. More than worked. This was already the most talked about moment of her career. Ray transitioned from the jazz improvisation into Chopin, Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece that told a story without words, that moved from gentle to violent and back again, that captured the full range of human emotion in 15 minutes of music. But Ray didn't play the whole piece. Instead, he played selected movements, weaving them together with his own compositions, creating a medley that told a different story. His story. The gentle opening represented childhood innocence, the discovery of music. The harsh middle sections captured war trauma loss. And then slowly, the music transformed again. Not back to innocence, you can't return to innocence once it's lost, but into something new. Acceptance. Resilience. The kind of strength that comes from surviving. His playing was getting stronger now. His hands, which had started uncertain and stiff, were loosening up. 15 years of not playing meant the first 30 minutes were about relearning remembering. But now 40 minutes in the muscle memory was fully engaged. His body remembered, even if his conscious mind had tried to forget. The pain was intense. Nerve damage doesn't go away. But Ray had learned to live with pain. Had learned that sometimes you push through because something matters more than comfort. This mattered. This mattered more than anything had mattered in years. In the audience, Richard Blackwell was having something like an existential crisis. He was 63 years old, had built a fortune through shrewd investments and ruthless business practices, had spent his life around wealth and power. And in this moment, watching a homeless man play piano with scarred hands, he was confronting the uncomfortable truth that he'd never created anything beautiful in his entire life. He'd made money, lots of it, but he'd never made art. Never made something that could move people to tears, that could change how they saw the world, that could matter beyond the quarterly earnings report. The woman next to him, his wife of 35 years, reached over and took his hand. She was crying. They looked at each other, and something passed between them. An understanding. A shared moment of recognizing that they'd almost missed this. Almost let their prejudices and assumptions rob them of witnessing something extraordinary. Ray played on, unaware of the individual reactions, focused entirely on the music. He was in that rare state musicians call flow, where conscious thought disappears, and you become the instrument where the music plays through you rather than being played by you. He moved through Gershwin, then back to classical with Debussy, then into a spiritual he'd learned from Miss Patterson, then into one of his own compositions from his Juilliard days. Each piece flowed into the next, creating a musical journey that kept the audience completely captivated. People who had been checking their phones were now staring at the stage. People who had been ready to leave were pressed forward in their seats. The room had gone from hostile to transformed. And Ray, lost in the music, was transformed too. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't a broken veteran, or a homeless man, or a collection of failures and regrets. He was simply a musician doing what he was born to do. Ray had been playing for almost 45 minutes straight. His hands were screaming. The scar tissue was pulled tight. The nerve damage was causing sharp shooting pains up his arms. He could feel his fingers starting to lose dexterity as fatigue set in. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Because he'd saved the most important piece for last. Without pause, without warning, Ray began playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, third movement. This was the piece he was supposed to debut at Lincoln Center 22 years ago. The performance that never happened. The future that was stolen by cancer and death and circumstances beyond his control. It was also one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. 10 minutes of virtuosic playing that demanded everything a pianist had: speed, power, precision, emotional depth. Even healthy pianists struggled with it. Ray played the opening bars, and the audience collectively held its breath. They knew this piece. Everyone knew this piece. It had been used in movies and commercials, had become almost cliché through overexposure. But hearing it played live, really played by someone who understood it in their bones, that was different. The concerto was meant to be played with an orchestra. Ray was alone with the piano, but his playing filled the hall like he had 100 musicians behind him. His left hand provided the bass, the foundation, the orchestra's lower strings, and timpani. His right hand sang the melody, became the violins and woodwinds, and the piano's solo voice all at once. The music was powerful, dramatic building and releasing tension in waves. It was the sound of triumph over tragedy, of beauty, emerging from pain of the human spirit, refusing to be crushed. Ray poured everything into it. Every ounce of grief over his mother. Every moment of suffering on the streets. Every nightmare from Afghanistan. Every time he'd wanted to give up but didn't. Every scar inside and out. His hands were barely functional now. The pain was so intense he could taste it. But he played through it, channeling the pain into the music, making it part of the performance rather than an obstacle to it. The audience was on the edge of their seats. Some people were crying openly. Others sat with their mouths open, unable to process what they were witnessing. The energy in the room was electric, overwhelming. The music climbed higher, faster, more complex. The famous passage that sounds like a cascade of notes that requires the pianist's hands to move in seemingly impossible ways. Ray's damaged hands fumbled some notes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He adjusted, adapted, found ways to suggest the notes his fingers couldn't quite reach. And somehow, incredibly, it worked. The imperfections became part of the story. Each missed note, each adjustment, each moment where his body betrayed him made the performance more real, more human, more moving. Because perfect technique is impressive, but you can hear perfect technique on any recording. What you can't hear on a recording is the sound of a man playing with hands that shouldn't be able to do this. The sound of someone giving absolutely everything they have, holding nothing back, risking complete failure for the chance at transcendence. The music built to a thunderous climax. Ray's entire body was involved now. His shoulders, his back, his legs on the pedals. Every part of him was engaged in creating this sound. The final section was approaching. The part where the piano seems to explode in a cascade of octaves and chords. Ray's hands were shaking violently. The pain was white-hot. He could feel something tearing in his left hand, probably scar tissue finally giving way. But he played. He played through the pain, through the physical limitations, through 15 years of silence and suffering. He played like it was the last thing he would ever do. He played like his life depended on it, because in a way it did. This wasn't just about music anymore. This was about proving that broken things can still be beautiful, that you can lose everything and still have value, that the worth of a human being isn't measured by their address or their bank account or their appearance, but by what lives inside them, by the gifts they carry, by the spirit that refuses to be extinguished no matter what the world throws at them. The Rachmaninoff was reaching its conclusion. The famous ending, where the piano seems to soar above everything, reaching for something beyond itself. Ray's hands were barely responding now. Each note required enormous effort, but he was so close to finishing. The melody climbed higher. Ray's right hand was playing octaves in the highest register, while his left hand provided thunderous chords in the bass. The sound filled the hall, reverberating off the walls, shaking something loose in everyone who heard it. This was the sound of triumph. Not easy triumph, not pretty triumph, but hard-earned blood and tears triumph. The kind that only comes after you've been completely broken and somehow found a way to put yourself back together. Ray could barely see. Tears were streaming down his face. His whole body hurt. But he was smiling. Actually smiling. Because after 15 years of being dead inside, he felt alive again. The music reached the final crescendo. The moment when the concerto explodes in one last glorious declaration. Ray brought both hands down on the keys with everything he had left. The chords rang out, massive and triumphant. Ray held them, letting them resonate, letting the sound fill every corner of the hall. And then slowly he played the final notes. Soft now, gentle, a resolution, the storm passing. Peace after chaos. The last chord hung in the air. Ray's hands remained on the keys holding the final position. His eyes were closed. His chest was heaving. Sweat dripped from his face onto the piano. And then silence. Complete, absolute silence. The chord faded, the reverb died away, and the hall was quiet as a tomb. 500 people sat frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Ray opened his eyes slowly. He lifted his hands from the keys. His fingers were trembling uncontrollably. He could see blood on the white keys where his scar tissue had split open. He looked at his hands, these broken, impossible hands, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked him over. He'd done it, against every odd, every limitation, every voice that said it was impossible. He'd played, really played. Not perfectly, but truly. The silence continued. Ray slowly turned on the bench to face the audience. He could see their faces in the stage lights. They were staring at him like they'd seen a ghost, like they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Ray stood up on shaking legs. He didn't know what to do. Should he bow? Should he leave? Should he say something? And then from the third row, the same woman who had clapped first stood up. She was crying. Her face was streaked with tears, and she started clapping. This time the response was instantaneous. The entire hall erupted. 500 people stood as one. The applause was deafening, overwhelming, a physical force that hit Ray like a wave. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't obligatory charity event clapping. This was real. Raw. People weren't just applauding the music. They were applauding the man. The story. The impossible thing they'd just witnessed. Bravo, someone shouted. Then others picked it up. Bravo. Bravo. People were crying. Not just a few. Dozens of them. Men in tuxedos wiping their eyes. Women in gowns openly sobbing. The emotional release was palpable. For 45 minutes, Ray had taken them on a journey, and they'd arrived somewhere unexpected. Somewhere that made them feel more human, more connected, more aware of their own capacity for judgment and redemption. Richard Blackwell was on his feet, clapping harder than anyone around him. His face was red, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. The man who had demanded Ray be thrown out was now applauding with an intensity that bordered on desperate, like he was trying to apologize with his hands to make up for the cruelty of his initial reaction. The applause continued. 1 minute, 2 minutes. People showed no signs of stopping. Some were whistling. Others were stomping their feet. The sound was thunderous. Ray stood on the stage completely overwhelmed. He'd played for audiences before, had received applause at Juilliard recitals and competitions. But nothing like this. This was something else entirely. This was 500 people telling him that he mattered, that his music mattered, that his story mattered. Sarah Chen ran onto the stage. She was laughing and crying simultaneously. She threw her arms around Ray, this stranger she'd taken a chance on. "That was incredible," she kept saying. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen." Others were moving toward the stage now. Audience members pressing forward, wanting to get closer to see him, to touch him somehow. Security guards had to form a gentle barrier to keep people from rushing the stage entirely. A woman in an elegant black dress pushed through to the front. My father was a veteran, she called up to Ray. He died homeless. Nobody helped him. Nobody saw him. Thank you for this. Thank you for reminding us. A man in his 70s, wearing his own military medals on his tuxedo jacket, saluted Ray from the audience. Other veterans in the crowd did the same. A silent moment of respect passing between soldiers. The applause finally began to die down, not because people were done, but because some of them needed to speak, needed to express what they were feeling. Richard Blackwell made his way to the front. He looked up at Ray, and their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Blackwell did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He bowed his head. A gesture of respect, of apology, of acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the remaining applause. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. Completely wrong." Ray just nodded. He understood. We're all wrong sometimes. We all judge too quickly, see too little, assume too much. What matters is what you do next. A reporter from the Times pushed forward. "Sir, what's your name? We need to know your name. The world needs to hear your story." Ray looked at all these people, these privileged, powerful people who an hour ago had wanted him gone. Now they wanted his story, wanted to know him, wanted to help. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was everything he'd lost and never thought he'd find again. "Ray," he finally said, his voice rough from emotion. "Ray Bennett. Mr. Bennett, the reporter said his phone out recording what you just did was extraordinary. How did you learn to play like that? Where have you been? Why haven't we heard of you before?" Ray looked down at his bloody, scarred hands. How could he explain 22 years in a few words? How could he summarize the journey from Juilliard to Afghanistan to the streets of Manhattan? But then he thought about his mother, thought about her last words. "Make them hear your song." "This is for my mother," Ray said into the reporter's phone. "Angela Bennett. She worked 3 jobs to give me a chance at music. She died before she could see me succeed, but she told me to never give up on my gift. I forgot that for a long time. I let the pain make me forget. But tonight I remembered. This was for her. Everything I am, everything I was, everything I might still be. This was for her." His voice broke on the last word. And then he couldn't speak anymore because Sarah was hugging him again, and other people were reaching up to shake his hand, and the applause was starting again. And Ray Bennett, who had been invisible for so long, was suddenly the most visible person in the room. The video started spreading within an hour. Multiple people had recorded Ray's performance on their phones. By midnight, clips were all over social media. By morning, it had gone viral. Homeless veteran gives performance of a lifetime was trending on every platform. News outlets picked it up. The New York Times ran a front-page story. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC all wanted interviews. The video was viewed 20 million times in the first 48 hours. But it wasn't just the music that resonated. It was the story. The visual of this homeless man, rejected and scorned, silencing a room full of wealthy critics with pure talent and heart. It was a story about judgment and redemption that spoke to something deep in the American psyche. The Veterans Administration immediately reached out. They apologized for the system failing. Ray promised to help with housing and medical care. Mental health organizations offered therapy for his PTSD. Multiple piano makers offered to provide him with instruments. And Richard Blackwell, true to the transformation he'd experienced that night, did more than apologize. He personally paid off Ray's medical debts. All of them. Hundreds of thousands of dollars gone with a stroke of a pen. Then he set up a trust fund to ensure Ray would never be homeless again. But Blackwell didn't stop there. He contacted other business leaders, and together they created the Second Chances Foundation, dedicated to helping homeless veterans get the support they needed. Not just housing and food, but job training, mental health services, addiction treatment, and arts programs. Because that night had taught them something crucial. There are Ray Bennetts everywhere. Invisible people with stories and talents and value that society has written off. The question wasn't whether they deserved help. The question was why it had taken them so long to see it. Within a week, Ray had a small apartment in Queens. Within a month, he was in therapy twice a week, finally addressing his PTSD with professional help. Within 2 months, he was practicing piano 3 hours a day, rebuilding his strength and technique. Concert halls reached out with offers. Recording companies wanted to sign him. But Ray turned most of them down. He'd been famous once, known what that pressure felt like. He didn't need fame. He needed purpose. So he started teaching. He went back to the Harlem Community Center where he'd first learned to play. Miss Patterson had passed away years earlier, but the piano was still there, that same beaten-up upright. Ray started offering free lessons to kids who couldn't afford them otherwise. He also started performing at VA hospitals, at homeless shelters, anywhere veterans gathered. Not concert-level performances. Just music. Just the gift shared freely with people who needed it. 6 months after that November night, Carnegie Hall offered Ray something special. Not just a performance, but a benefit concert. All proceeds would go to homeless veteran services. It would be called Ray's Promise, after his mother's last words. The concert sold out in 4 hours. Remember those questions we asked at the beginning? What would you do if everyone told you that you were worthless? Ray Bennett had lived that reality for 15 years. The world had looked at him and seen garbage, seen someone to be avoided, seen nothing. What if the world looked at you and saw only failure? Ray had every reason to believe that's all he was. A Juilliard dropout, a damaged veteran, a homeless man. By every measure society uses, he had failed. Could you prove them wrong with just one chance? Ray didn't just prove them wrong. He reminded 500 people, and eventually millions more, that human value isn't determined by circumstance. That talent doesn't disappear just because life gets hard. That broken things can still create beauty. But this story isn't really about Ray Bennett. Not entirely. It's about every person we pass on the street without seeing. Every homeless veteran we step around on our way to somewhere important. Every human being we've reduced to a problem or a statistic instead of seeing as someone with a story with value, with dreams that may have been deferred but not destroyed. Ray's story is extraordinary because of his talent. But the truth behind his story is universal. Every invisible person has something inside them worth knowing. Every broken person deserves a chance at redemption. Every human being, regardless of their circumstances, has inherent dignity that should be recognized and respected. That night in November, Ray Bennett didn't just play piano. He held up a mirror to everyone in that hall and to everyone who watched the video afterward. And that mirror asked uncomfortable questions. Who have you written off? Who have you refused to see? What miracles have you missed because you judged too quickly? 6 months after his Carnegie Hall performance, Ray Bennett sat in his apartment looking at his scarred hands. They still hurt. They always would. But they could play. Imperfectly, yes, but truly. On his wall hung a photo of his mother taken the day he got his Juilliard acceptance letter. She was beaming with pride, her arm around her 18-year-old son. Ray looked at that photo every day. And every day, he kept his promise. Music saved me once, when I was a child. Ray told a reporter at that Carnegie Hall benefit concert. It gave me hope when I had nothing else. Then I lost it for a long time. Lost myself. But that night at the Riverside Hall, music saved me again. It reminded me who I was underneath all the pain and trauma. It gave me back my voice. He paused, looking out at the crowd of thousands who had come to hear him play and to support homeless veterans. So here's what I want everyone to remember, Ray continued. Never give up on your gifts, no matter how broken you feel. Never stop believing that you have something valuable to offer this world. And most importantly, never forget that the person you're ignoring on the street, the person you're judging by their appearance, the person you've written off as worthless, might be carrying something extraordinary inside them. Something that could change the world if only someone would give them the chance to share it. My mother used to say, music is a gift that comes through us, not from us. She meant that our talents aren't really ours. They're meant to be shared, to heal, to connect, to remind us all of our shared humanity. So yeah, I can play piano again. But that's not the real miracle. The real miracle is remembering that we all have gifts. All of us. And we all deserve the chance to share them, to be seen, to matter. Ray smiled, his scarred hands resting gently on the piano keys. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for giving me that chance. And I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure others get that same chance. Because everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves to matter. Everyone deserves a second chance. The applause that followed was thunderous. But Ray barely heard it. He was already playing,